chosen one. Long before you had language for it, long before you understood words like discernment, calling, spiritual sensitivity, or separation, there was already something inside you that knew your experience was not ordinary. Even as a child, you could feel that something about the way you moved through the world was different from the people around you. You may not have had proof. You may not have been able to explain it to adults. But somewhere deep inside, you knew that you were noticing more than other people seemed to notice, feeling more than others appeared to feel, and carrying questions that did not match your age. Many chosen ones remember this without always understanding it at first. They remember feeling out of place in rooms where nothing looked obviously wrong. They remember sensing that the atmosphere of certain people, homes, schools, or social groups affected them more deeply than it seemed to affect anyone else. They remember trying to fit in, trying to respond like everyone else, trying to become comfortable with what others accepted naturally. Yet something inside them kept resisting complete conformity. This often made childhood confusing, because when you are young, you assume difference must mean something is wrong with you. You do not yet know that some forms of difference are not dysfunction. Some are distinction. Some are the earliest signs that God placed something on your life before you had the maturity to understand it. This is why many chosen ones felt older on the inside than they were on the outside. Even when their body was still young, there was often a seriousness, an awareness, an inward depth, or a strange emotional maturity that set them apart from their peers. They may have been drawn to questions others never asked. They may have felt uncomfortable with cruelty, dishonesty, noise, shallow behavior, or certain kinds of social performance long before they could explain why. They may have carried a sensitivity that adults called overreacting, weakness, moodiness, or being too emotional, when in reality, much of that sensitivity was early discernment. God often marks the chosen one before the world knows what it is looking at. Heaven recognizes what earth misunderstands, and because of that, many chosen ones spend years being mislabeled before their difference starts making sense. Some were called too quiet because they were processing more deeply than others. Some were called too serious because their spirit could not fully relax into the kind of surface life others found normal. Some were called strange, sensitive, intense, or overly observant because they were registering what other people lacked the awareness to notice. This does not mean every unusual child is chosen in some mystical sense, but it does mean that many chosen ones can trace their story back to a very early awareness that they were not built to move through life unconsciously. Even as children, they often picked up on emotional undercurrents, tension in rooms, dishonesty in voices, or sadness in people who were pretending to be fine. They felt atmospheres. They noticed contradictions. They sensed danger or discomfort before it became obvious. And while that gift often felt like a burden in childhood, it was also one of the earliest signs that their spirit was already recognizing things others could not yet see. This is why childhood often feels so unusual in hindsight for the chosen one. At the time, it feels like confusion. Later, it begins to look like evidence. You begin realizing that your early sensitivity was not meaningless. Your inability to fully lose yourself in the crowd was not random. The fact that you could never completely become comfortable in certain environments, even when others seemed fine, was not always social weakness. It was often the mark of a spirit that was never meant to sleepwalk through life. God was allowing your awareness to form early because your future would require a level of perception that could not begin at the moment of public purpose. He was planting depth before definition. He was shaping your inner life before anyone had language for your calling. This is one of the reasons chosen ones often carry a quiet ache when they think about childhood. There is usually a sense that they were living through something they did not understand. They were trying to survive emotional realities, spiritual impressions, inner questions, and social disconnects without the words to explain any of it. And when people around them misunderstood that difference, It often created shame. They learned to hide parts of themselves. They tried to become easier to understand. They tried to act more normal, less intense, less inward, less alert. But even when they adjusted externally, the deeper difference remained. It would not leave, because it was not a phase. It was part of how God had marked them. Throughout Scripture, God often set people apart long before public purpose arrived. He began the work early, before the world had context, before the person themselves had language, before the assignment was visible. The chosen one must remember this, because one of the enemy's favorite lies is to make you think your early difference was proof of defect. But many times it was proof of distinction. The very thing that made you feel hard to understand may have been the first whisper of a life that would not follow an ordinary pattern. God often places a mark on the chosen one early. Before the world understands them, heaven already recognizes what has been set apart.
And once you begin seeing your childhood through that lens, another truth starts becoming clearer. Some of the loneliness and emotional distance you experienced early did not only wound you, it also started shaping an inner world that would later become part of your strength. Chosen one. One reason your childhood may have felt so unusual is because God was already allowing a kind of inward separation to shape you long before you understood what was happening. Many chosen ones were not only different in how they perceived life, they were also different in how alone they often felt inside it. Even when people were physically around, there was sometimes a strange emotional distance, a sense of being unseen, unheard, or disconnected in ways that were difficult to explain. You may have been surrounded by family, classmates, routines, and ordinary life, yet still carried the deep feeling that something in you was standing apart.
This kind of loneliness is especially confusing in childhood, because children do not usually have the language to describe spiritual isolation. They only know that they feel different, misunderstood, or inwardly alone. And because they cannot name it clearly, they often assume the problem must be themselves. But many times, what was happening was not simple rejection. It was early formation. God was already building depth in you through experiences that separated you inwardly from others. This does not mean the pain was pleasant or easy. It often hurt deeply. Chosen ones frequently carry memories of early misunderstanding, emotional distance, or hardship that seemed to isolate them from the normal ease other children appeared to have. Some felt invisible in homes where practical needs were met, but emotional connection was missing. Some were surrounded by people, yet still felt unknown.
Some learned very early that they could not fully depend on the people around them to understand what they were feeling. Others carried pain, tension, instability, or responsibility earlier than their age should have required. Whatever form it took, the effect was similar. Your inner life had to grow quickly because the outer environment did not provide the same sense of safety, resonance, or simple belonging that others seemed to receive. This is one of the hidden ways God often shapes a chosen one. He does not waste early pain, even though the pain itself was never light. The loneliness was painful, but it forced you to develop an inner world others did not have. You learned to reflect because there were moments when no one else could hold what you were carrying. You learned to observe because silence made you pay attention to details that louder environments would have buried. You learned to endure inwardly because emotional ease was not always available. And in that hidden place, something began forming that would later become part of your strength. Many chosen ones were being taught how to sit with themselves long before they wanted to. They were learning how to survive emotionally without constant external reinforcement. They were learning how to process, question, and endure in silence. What looked like difficulty on the outside was often also building unusual depth on the inside. That depth would later become discernment. It would become emotional range, spiritual hunger, and the ability to perceive what others missed. But as children,
It often just felt like being different in a painful way. This is why many chosen ones look back and realize that childhood felt heavier than it looked. There was a seriousness inside them, a kind of inward awareness that grew because pain had already made them listen more deeply than others. Hardship often accelerated maturity.
It made you notice emotional undercurrents, patterns, motives, and instability earlier than most people ever had to. It created a resilience that was not loud, but real. You may not have called it resilience at the time. You may have called it survival. But survival, when offered to God, often becomes strength. The same hardship that made childhood difficult also trained your spirit in ways that later mattered more than you could have imagined. It made you less naive. It made you capable of depth. It created a hunger for something truer than what the surface of life was offering you. This is one reason chosen ones often become spiritually hungry earlier than others. Pain creates questions. Isolation creates inward searching. Being emotionally distant from the crowd often pushes a person to seek something deeper than human understanding alone. The ache of not fully belonging in ordinary places can become the beginning of longing for God. What others found in social ease, chosen ones often had to seek in spiritual depth. And while that journey began with pain, it was also part of their preparation. The hidden loneliness was not meaningless. God was using even that. He was forming an inner life strong enough to carry things public life would later demand. He was creating someone who could reflect deeply, endure quietly, and stay sensitive without becoming shallow. This does not mean early pain was ideal. It means it was not wasted. The chosen one must understand this, because childhood wounds often become adult shame if they are never reinterpreted through God's purpose. You can spend years thinking the loneliness made you broken, when in reality, it was also building unusual capacity. It taught you to listen inwardly. It taught you to watch carefully. It taught you to survive seasons where understanding was not available, and those lessons would one day become part of your spiritual maturity. The pain of being different often became part of the preparation for your calling, not because God delights in your hardship, but because He refuses to let hardship remain empty when it touches someone He has marked. He turns silent suffering into hidden strength. He turns misunderstood years into discernment. He turns the ache of not fitting in into the courage to stop needing the crowd in order to obey Him. This is one of the great mysteries of the chosen one's story. What looked like early disadvantage was often also deep formation. What made childhood difficult was also making your soul more awake than you realized. And as that inner world continued developing, another thing was happening too. Long before you knew what discernment was, you may have already been living with it. Chosen one, before you had the language for discernment, you may have already been living with it. That is one of the reasons childhood felt so intense, so confusing, and so difficult to explain. You were sensing things long before you could interpret them. You were reading atmospheres before you understood what atmosphere meant. You were picking up on tension, dishonesty, emotional distance, hidden motives, or spiritual heaviness before anyone around you was willing to admit that those things were even present. As a child, this can feel overwhelming because you do not yet know how to separate what you feel from what others insist is normal. You only know that certain people make you uneasy even when everyone else seems comfortable around them. You know that certain rooms feel heavy even when nothing obvious is being said. You know that some smiles do not feel sincere. Some homes do not feel safe. Some conversations carry a pressure you cannot explain. And some situations make your spirit tighten, even when adults dismiss your reaction as imagination or oversensitivity. This is what makes early discernment such a difficult gift. It often shows up before maturity, before emotional vocabulary, and before anyone around you is wise enough to help you understand what is happening inside you. So instead of being guided, many chosen ones were corrected. Instead of being helped, they were told they were too sensitive, too serious, too emotional, too dramatic, or too hard to please. But the truth was often far deeper than that. What others called oversensitivity was sometimes spiritual perception developing before you had the words to explain it. You were not only reacting emotionally, you were registering what others were missing. This is why childhood could feel so confusing. You could feel more than you could explain. You sensed dishonesty before the evidence appeared. You picked up on mood shifts before anyone admitted something was wrong. You noticed when someone's words and energy did not match. You may have had strong reactions to places, people, or events that made no sense to others. And because you could not defend those reactions logically, you learned to doubt your own inner awareness. Many chosen ones spent years assuming something was wrong with their nervous system, when in reality, something was active in their discernment. This is not to romanticize every childhood feeling as divine. Children can be anxious, imaginative, overstimulated, and emotionally impressionable. But for many chosen ones, there was something more happening alongside all of that. There was a spiritual sensitivity that made ordinary environments feel unusually intense. There was an alertness to emotional atmospheres that went beyond normal observation. There was a kind of inward knowing that would later, with time and maturity, become easier to name. This is why some chosen ones also remember strange dreams, vivid intuitions, strong inner impressions, and emotional responses that felt disproportionate to their age. They may have sensed danger before it became visible. They may have dreamt things that later seemed connected to real situations. They may have felt drawn towards certain truths or repelled by certain influences without understanding why. At the time, these experiences often felt strange or even embarrassing. But later, many chosen ones realized they were not random. They were signs that discernment had started early, even though understanding came much later. God sometimes gives the chosen one spiritual sensitivity before maturity fully catches up. And that is exactly why childhood can feel unusually deep. You are living with a kind of awareness you cannot yet organize. You feel things your mind cannot categorize. You know things your age cannot defend. And because of that, you can end up carrying confusion about yourself for years. The very part of you that was meant to become wisdom later feels like a burden early. You may have wished you were less aware, less affected, less intense, less inward, and less troubled by things that others seemed able to ignore. But what if that early sensitivity was never meant to shame you? What if it was evidence that your spirit was already awake in ways your surroundings did not know how to handle? Scripture shows again and again that God often marks people before they understand the mark. He begins working in them before public purpose appears. He allows sensitivity, perception, and spiritual hunger to grow before there is language for calling. That early intensity is difficult, but it is not meaningless. It is often where the deeper formation begins. The chosen one was not meant to move through life asleep. That does not mean every instinct was perfect or every childhood feeling was revelation. It means the soil of your inner life was different from early on. Your sensitivity had a purpose. Your discomfort had a purpose. Your inability to fully relax into what others called normal had a purpose. God was allowing your inner senses to sharpen because one day you would need to recognize truth beneath appearances, motives beneath words, and danger before it fully manifested. But before discernment becomes useful, it often feels isolating. A child who senses more than they can explain will often feel out of step with the crowd. They may not enjoy what others enjoy. They may not trust what others trust so easily. They may not lose themselves in the same way other children can. That difference can lead to misunderstanding, rejection, or labels that stay with a person for years. And that is why the next part of the Chosen One story matters so much. What felt like not belonging may not have been failure at all. It may have been the beginning of God separating you from the crowd long before He explained why. Chosen One. What felt like not belonging may have actually been the beginning of separation. This is one of the most painful truths to understand, because when you are young, difference usually feels like deficiency. You do not yet know how to interpret your inability to fully lose yourself in the crowd. You only know that other people seem more comfortable than you do, more naturally connected to the atmosphere around them, more willing to enjoy what everyone else is chasing, and less troubled by things that leave your spirit unsettled. So you try to adapt. You try to laugh at what they laugh at, care about what they care about, enjoy what they enjoy, and move with the same rhythm. But something in you keeps resisting. Even when you wanted acceptance, some part of your soul would not completely surrender itself to the environment. You could participate, but rarely fully disappear into it. You could be present, but inwardly you often remain separate. You may have found it difficult to enjoy what others were fully consumed by. You may have felt strangely detached from trends, superficial excitement, group pressure, or the emotional energy of the crowd. While others seemed able to flow with whatever the room demanded, your spirit often stayed inward, observant, and unconvinced. This did not always make sense to you at the time. In fact, it may have made you feel broken. People may have called you strange, too quiet, too serious, too deep, too emotional, too intense, too hard to read, or too hard to include. Some may have assumed you were arrogant when you were actually just inward. Others may have interpreted your caution as distance, your depth as heaviness, or your sensitivity as weakness. But many times, what they were seeing was not dysfunction. It was distinction. God was allowing you to feel separate because your path was never meant to be shaped by the crowd. That does not mean He wanted you to live in shame or confusion. It means He was protecting something in you from being fully absorbed into environments that could not define your future. There are people who are built to learn through belonging, and there are people who are built to learn through separation. The Chosen One often belongs to the second category. God frequently separates before He explains. He creates a holy discomfort with the crowd long before the person understands that the discomfort is part of their design. This is why so many Chosen Ones look back on childhood and realize that their difference was not accidental. They were being kept from full conformity because conformity would have muted the very discernment, depth, and spiritual hunger that God was developing in them. If you had blended in completely, you may never have questioned the atmosphere. If you had felt fully at home in every crowd, you may never have developed the inward life that now helps you recognize what is true. If you had been rewarded for dissolving yourself into other people's expectations, you might have grown dependent on the crowd's approval instead of on God's voice. So what felt like alienation was sometimes hidden mercy. The separation hurt, but it also protected the forming of your identity. Many Chosen Ones were not allowed to fully enjoy what others were consumed by because their spirit was being reserved for something deeper. They were drawn inward, reflective, and hungry for meaning before they had any public reason to be. This often created loneliness because children and young people usually do not know how to honor what is inward and different. They react to it. They label it. They mock it. They exclude it. And those labels can wound deeply. But labels are not definitions. Being called strange does not mean you are disordered. Being called too serious does not mean you are joyless. Being called too emotional does not mean you are unstable. Sometimes those labels were simply the crowd's way of reacting to something they did not understand. The Chosen One often gets named by the crowd before they are understood by it. And if they are not careful, They can spend years trying to heal from a shame that came from being different in the wrong environment. But once God begins opening your eyes, the whole picture changes. You begin seeing that the problem was not always your inability to become like everyone else. Sometimes the problem was that you were never meant to. You are not called to let the crowd train your taste, shape your conscience, or define your pace. You are not designed to become comfortable with every atmosphere that made others feel normal. Your discomfort was often a sign. It was the early evidence that your path would require discernment stronger than social pressure. This is why God frequently separates the chosen one before revealing why. He allows alienation in hidden form before distinction becomes visible in public. He lets you feel the weight of not fully belonging before he shows you that your life was never meant to be built by the crowd's acceptance. What felt like early rejection was often divine distinction in disguise. It was God teaching your spirit, even in pain, that your assignment would require a loyalty deeper than popularity. And that lesson matters because one day, when purpose becomes clearer, you will need the courage to stand apart without calling it failure. You will need the strength to obey, even when it means not being easily understood. You will need the wisdom to recognize that what once made you feel isolated was also shaping your ability to hear God without needing constant agreement from the room. This is why the chosen one must stop interpreting every childhood difference through the lens of defect. Some of the very things that made you feel distant from the crowd were signs that heaven was already drawing a boundary around your life. Not to shame you, but to keep you from being swallowed by patterns that were never meant to own you. And when you finally begin seeing that, another truth rises to the surface. The difference you carried since childhood was never meant to humiliate you. It was meant to identify you. Chosen one, there comes a point in your life when the pieces begin to come together, and the thing that once made you feel strange starts looking like evidence. What embarrassed you early begins making sense later. The sensitivity, the loneliness, the inwardness, the questions, the discomfort with the crowd, the awareness you could not explain, the depth that felt too heavy for your age, the sense that you were living inside a different emotional and spiritual weather than the people around you. All of it begins to form a pattern. And once that pattern becomes visible, you realize something that changes the whole way you interpret your story. The difference you carried since childhood was not meant to shame you. It was meant to identify you. It was one of the earliest signs that God had been shaping something set apart long before public purpose ever appeared. This is one of the great turning points in the chosen one's healing, because many spend years trying to recover from being unlike others without realizing that their difference was part of the design, not proof of defect. They look back on childhood and remember how abnormal they felt, how misunderstood they were, how much inner weight they carried, and how often they wished they could just feel ordinary. But when God starts reframing your life through the lens of calling, your memories begin changing meaning. The patterns that once looked random begin revealing intention. Your sensitivity was not just inconvenience. Your loneliness was not just misfortune. Your deep questions were not just mental overactivity. Your early awareness was not just social difficulty. God was shaping perception, endurance, spiritual hunger, and unusual depth in places where no one around you knew how to honor what was growing. The chosen one often spends many years feeling abnormal before realizing they were marked for a different assignment. That is why so much of early life feels confusing. You are carrying signs before you understand the purpose behind them. You are experiencing preparation before there is language for destiny. You are being formed in private places before public clarity catches up. This is why your journey was never meant to look like everyone else's. A life that is set apart rarely begins in obvious ways. It often begins in hidden discomfort, in unexplainable difference, in seasons of feeling out of step with people and environments that seem easy for others. The world tends to call that weakness, because it only values what looks socially smooth, emotionally easy, and publicly affirmed. But heaven often begins its deepest work in the exact places the world misunderstands. God will let the chosen one feel their difference long before he explains it, because some things have to be grown before they can be named. He was building your spiritual awareness before he showed you why you would need it. He was deepening your emotional range before he revealed how much discernment your future would require. He was allowing you to feel the ache of not fully belonging, because one day you would need the courage to stand apart without collapsing. This is why the chosen one's childhood often contains signs that only make sense later. The early loneliness taught endurance. The early misunderstanding taught inward strength. The early sensitivity taught perception. The early separation taught you not to lose yourself completely in the crowd. The early questions taught you to seek what is real rather than just what is accepted. None of that was wasted. None of it was accidental. None of it was outside God's awareness. Even the parts that hurt were not left meaningless. God often begins his work in the chosen one long before visible calling appears, which means the signs are usually present early, though misunderstood at the time. What felt like burden may now be recognized as preparation. What felt like weakness may now reveal itself as discernment. What felt like being too much may now appear as unusual capacity. What felt like not fitting in may now look like evidence that you were never meant to be shaped by ordinary patterns alone. This does not mean everything painful in your childhood was sent by God in some simplistic way. It means God was present in it. He was able to use it. He was shaping something through it that the people around you could not yet see. The chosen one must hold this truth carefully, because it keeps the heart from living under old shame. You are not called to romanticize your pain, but you are called to reinterpret it honestly. There is a difference. Reinterpretation means you stop viewing your difference as a lifelong sentence of being too strange, too sensitive, too quiet, too intense, too inward, too aware, or too separate. Instead, you begin seeing that those things were often early evidence that your life was going to require a deeper kind of formation. The assignment on your life was never ordinary. So the signs of that assignment were never going to feel fully ordinary either. And once that truth settles into your spirit, your whole relationship with your past starts changing. You stop trying to erase what made you different. You begin honoring what it taught you. You stop wishing you had been more like everyone else. You begin realizing that being like everyone else may have made you easier to understand, but it would have weakened the very qualities God was building for your future. You stop measuring yourself against people whose path was never meant to mirror yours. You start seeing that your early difference was not an accident of temperament alone. It was often evidence of divine intention. God was forming something set apart. He was marking your soul for a life that would need discernment, resilience, depth, and spiritual sensitivity. And if you can begin seeing your story through that lens, then what once felt like a lonely mystery becomes something else entirely. It becomes confirmation. It becomes identity. It becomes the quiet proof that heaven recognized something in you long before the world ever understood it. Before we finish, take a moment to reflect on this message. If you have felt different since childhood, do not rush to call that difference a flaw. It may have been one of the earliest signs that God was shaping something set apart in you, long before you had words for it. If this message spoke to your story, like this video so it can reach another chosen one who has carried that same quiet question for years. Share it with someone who needs this kind of confirmation today. And if you want more content about the Chosen One journey, spiritual identity, and God-led transformation, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next message.